Now, looking at Acts 5:29 is going to make a point where it's obvious that these individuals that have us in captivity, they're going to have a certain way that we have to conduct ourselves, or a certain way that they want us to conduct ourselves. That's why when you go to Acts 5:29, it says, "Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men, because men is going to have a law that contradicts God. Men are going to have laws to try to tell you what to do. You see? And so that's why Peter even had to bring the situation up, because men are trying to deter you from the doctrine of YAHAWAH and the Most High God, YAHAWAH. So when you go into that whole line of thinking, when we went into captivity, what was happening? Now, let's see here. This is Virginia Slave Codes of 1705. You see? Now, let's get to the meat of it. Say these codes effectively embedded the ideal of slavery into law by the following devices: establish new property rights for slave owners, allow the legal free trade of slaves with protections granted by the courts, establish separate courts of trial, prohibit blacks, regardless of free status, from owning weapons. Whites could not be employed by blacks, allowed for the apparent apprehensions of subjects runaways. The law was devised to establish a greater level of control over the rising slave population of Virginia. It also served to socially segregate white colonists from black slaves, making them desperate groups, hindering their ability to unite. A unity of the commoners was a perceived fear of the Virginia aristocracy, which had to be addressed, and who wished to prevent repeat of events such as Bacon's Rebellion occurring 29 years prior. Okay, so that's Virginia. So let's go back and let's get typical slave codes. It says movement restrictions. Most regions required any slaves away from their plantation or outside of the cities they resided in to have a pass signed by their master. Many cities in the slave states required slave tags, small copper badges that enslaved people wore to show that they were allowed to move about. Marriage restrictions. Most places restricted the marriage rights of enslaved people. I still terrible wording. Ostensibly to prevent them from trying to change masters by marrying into a family on another plantation. Marriage between people of different races was also restricted. Prohibition on gathering. Slave codes generally prevented large groups of enslaved people from gathering away from their plantations. Slave patrols. In the slave-dependent portions of North America, varying degrees of legal authority backed slave patrols by plantation owners and other free whites to ensure that enslaved people were not free to move about at night and generally enforced the restriction on slaves. Trade and commerce by slaves. Initially, most places gave enslaved people some land to work personally and allowed them to operate their markets. As slavery became more profitable, uh, slave codes restricting the rights of enslaved people to buy, sell, and produce goods were introduced. In some places, slave tags were required to be worn by enslaved people to prove that they were allowed to participate in certain types of work. Punishment and killing of slaves. Slave codes regulated how slaves could be punished, usually going so far as to apply no penalty for accidental killing a slave while punishing him. Later laws began to apply restriction on this, but slave owners were still rarely punished for killing their slaves. Okay, let's get some other stuff. Education. Slave code made it illegal to teach slaves to read. All right. Now I want to get these other ones on here. Slovakia. Come on. Alright, let me get to my main menu because they don't kick me off the whole thing. Yeah, we know. The devil is watching. We're gonna get these slave codes. Slovakia, bear with me 1 second. We're gonna see how far these dragons gonna go. Okay, back to the beginning. There's one I want, and I guess I got to go right to it. Now let me get Spanish. Here we go. South Carolina. It says, this is South Carolina. Slaves were prohibited to leave the owner's property unless they were accompanied by a white person or had permission. If a slave leaves the owner's property without permission, every white person is required to chastise such slave. And any slave attempting to run away and leave the colony later, the state receives the death penalty. Any slave who invades capture for 20 days or more is to be publicly whipped for the first offense, branded with the letter R on the right cheek for the second offense, and lose one ear if absent for 30 days for the third offense, and castrated for the fourth offense. Owners refusing to abide by the slave code are fined and forfeit ownership of their slave. Slave homes are to be searched every 2 weeks for weapons and stolen goods. Punishment for violating escalates to include loss of ear, branding, nose slitting, and for the fourth offense, death. No slaves is allowed to work for pay, plant corn, peas, or rice, keep hogs, cattle, or horses, own or operate a boat, buy or sell. That's Revelation 13:16. Buy or sell, or to wear clothes finer than Negro cloth. The South Carolina slave codes were revised in 1739 with the following amendment: no slave is to be taught to write, work on Sunday, or to work more than 15 hours per day, and 14 in winter. Willful killing of a slave exacts a fine, 700 something, and passion killing 350. The fine for considering a runaway slave is $1,000 and prison time up to a year. A fine of 106 months in prison are imposed for employing any black or slave as a clerk. A fine of $100, 6 months in prison are imposed on anyone selling or giving alcoholic beverages to a slave. A fine of $100 and 6 months are imposed for teaching the slave to read, write, and death is the penalty for circulating incendiary literature. Freeing a slave is forbidden except by deed and offer and after 1820, permission of legislators, Georgia required legislative approval for after 1801. So you couldn't set somebody free unless you get the legislation of Georgia to approve you. Some elements of the codes were rarely and laxly enforced, as they impose costs or limitations upon slave owners. Let's see. Now I want to go back because I got one key to get in here before I close it out. Let's see if they try to rob me again. So now let's go to Code NOIR. This is the key. Code NOIR was a decree originally passed by France King Louis the 16th or something like that. In 1685, the Code NOIR defined the condition of slavery in the French colony empire, restricted the activities of free black people, made Roman Catholicism compulsory, meaning mandatory, and ordered all Jews out of France colonies. Okay. Now, I need to get to the nitty gritty. Context and origin. Here we go. No. Not that yet. Not that yet. Okay. Is it in popular culture? Nope, not that. Summary. There we go. Rules about religion. Jews could not reside in the French colonies. Slaves must be baptized in the Roman Universal Church. It wasn't no such thing as a Roman Universal Church. To give you clarity, slaves must be baptized in the Edomite Universal Church. Public exercise of any religion other than the Edomite universalism of God love everybody was prohibited. Masters who allowed or tolerated it by their slaves could be also punished. Only Catholic Edomite universal God love everybody marriages would be recognized. Rules about sexual relations and marriage. Children of a female slave and a free man. If the father was unmarried, he should marry the slave concubine, thus freeing her and her children from slavery. Otherwise, the punishment would be a fine for both the father and the slave master. The fine of 20,000 pounds of sugar. Sugar was powerful. If the father was the slave master's, in addition of the fine, the slave and the other resulting children would be removed from his ownership, but not freed. Wedding between slaves strictly required the master's permission, but also required the slave's own consent. Children born to married slaves were also slaves belonging to the female slave master. Children of a male slave and a free woman were free. Children of a free slave and a free man were slaves. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. But we see how these dragons, off the rip, the first thing in the French colony was that the Jews, or anybody going along with that, God only loved the Jews, God has a chosen people, you was kicked up out of their country. And they didn't care about nothing that you didn't hear no color. No color was emphasized. Wasn't no white people, wasn't no black people. In general, if you even thinking about going along with that concept that God only loved his peoples, you was booted up out of there. You see, you was booted up out of their country. And it was mandatory that you was baptized as an Edomite, universal, God love everybody, Christian. Mandatory. That's the first thing that these people had going on in the French colonies. And they had Haiti on lock, but they had other places on lock too. And most of the Edomites was operating like this. They just, focus on this with the French. But all of them was in the same agreement and they was on one page. Because they all knew that they was on some Edomite, they was Edomites. And you better not tell these people and anybody about the God love only the Jews. And he don't love everybody. See, we kicking you out this whole country. We gonna boot you out of our colony. And anything that we control, we booting you out of here. But the whole focus on that God only got a chosen people. And they was doing this to the blacks that was in slavery, the Hispanics, the Northern Kingdom that was in slavery, and the Indian that was in slavery, producing their wine. But I'm going to leave it there. All praise to YAHAWAH, by Hashem YAHWAH, by Hashem and Kakadash. Double honor to the elders pushing the truth. Peace to the elect worldwide. Our kingdom is at hand. Shalom.